Well, thank you, Nick and Jeff, for an amazing start to our pollinator webinar. My coworkers have been talking about the importance of native trees, plants, and how beneficial they are for a variety of pollinators. Well, monarchs use those same plants and those same trees. So it's necessary for us to plant species that bloom throughout the entire season and throughout the entire monarch migration. So especially we need to plant milkweeds because this is the only plant that the caterpillar will feed on. And here in Iowa, we have 18 native milkweeds, and 5 of those are so rare that they're considered threatened or endangered. So it's pretty simple. If there's no milkweed, there's no monarchs. So along with milkweed, we also need to consider those plants that bloom a little bit later in the season because the monarchs are going to feed from those plants and they're going to build up their fat reserves and store that in their abdomen to help them survive through the entire winter. So just a couple examples of some good prairie plants for those that late season would be the asters, your Joe Pye weed, blazing star, and bergamot, just to name a few. I know I have quite a bit of blazing star in my yard, and it is always filled with monarchs towards the fall time. They also need trees to roost and overnight. So those tree species here in the US includes large oaks and cottonwoods. And then they also need trees to overwinter in Mexico, which we'll talk about on another slide here. And of course, they need clean water sources. So why did I go to Mexico? Well, I spent about 22 years of my career as an environmental educator, and I was planting native species. I was teaching other people how to plant native species. And then I was doing a program about the biology and the life cycle of monarchs. I was also raising those monarchs. And then I've been known to run around the prairie to catch monarchs in order to tag them for their migration. So I was super excited about monarchs and spreading that word with everybody else. And I kind of learned things as I went. But for me, this needed something more. It needed a little bit more of a connection. So my connection became full circle when I actually traveled down to Mexico to see those overwintering sites. So before I share more details about my travels, it's important to understand the life cycle and the migration of the monarchs. So they go through what we call a complete metamorphosis, and this takes them about 30 days. So they'll go from that egg to caterpillar to chrysalis to butterfly. And it's a complete metamorphosis because each stage looks very different than the adult, unlike a grasshopper who goes through an incomplete metamorphosis. So like this, the young grasshopper looks like just a smaller version of the adult grasshopper. So the female will lay eggs over a 2 to 5 week season. And a little question for the audience out there: how many eggs does a female lay over the egg laying season? And again, that's 2 to 5 weeks. Go ahead and answer in the comment section there. I'd love to see the answers that people give. Maybe some of you already know this answer. Okay, so those are some really interesting answers. And I'll go ahead and give you the answer. So they lay between 300 to 500 eggs over that 2 to 5 week span. And they're going to lay these eggs only on milkweed plants. So when you're out looking for eggs, you're usually going to find them on that bottom side of the leaf, occasionally on the top. And then you'll also need to check on those teeny tiny leaves right in the center that are just coming up, because sometimes she will lay them right on those little leaves that are very small, and it's easy to miss those eggs because keep in mind, this egg is very tiny and it's hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for. But once you find a few, it gets a little bit easier to find them. And they'll be in this egg stage for about 3 to 5 days. And then they turn into that yellow, black, and white caterpillar that looks very familiar to many of you. And they will be 11 to 18 days in this stage, and they go through 5 instars. So that means the really teeny tiny caterpillar that you first find is in its first instar, and it will eat and eat and eat, and then it will shed its exoskeleton, and then it will eat some more, shed its exoskeleton again, and it will go through that 5 times, and on that last time is when it starts to form that chrysalis. So monarch butterflies have this really, really beautiful chrysalis in my mind because it's this bright sort of emerald green color with little dashes or little dots, a little line of gold around the top there. So when they're in their chrysalis, this is when they go through a huge transformation. So they develop their wings, they get their 6 legs, and they get their compound eyes. And then once this chrysalis starts to turn black, you're going to be able to see the butterfly inside, and then it will slowly emerge out, and it'll be all wrinkled up. And then you'll need to let it, you'll notice that it'll flap its wings to kind of dry. And then once it gets completely dry, that butterfly that you see in the last picture there will fly away and go to feed. So adults live for about 2 to 6 weeks, and the last generation lives about 8 to 9 months. So we'll kind of talk about those generations on one of our next slides. So this is why it's so important to have those native plants and milkweeds and flowers throughout each stage and along that migration route for these butterflies, because without those food sources, they wouldn't survive. So this map does a great job of showing the migration routes. So there is more than one migration route. If you go over to California, you can see that they kind of they go to California, they go north, they come back. Very simple migration. And then over on the east part of the state, they will go to Florida, fly up a little ways, fly back down to Florida, not nearly as far as the butterflies that are here in the Midwest. So a butterfly can travel or fly as far as 3,000 miles to reach Mexico, and that's roughly 1,200 to 2,800 miles. And they will often fly 50 to 100 miles per day, and that's depending on the wind current. So if you have a really windy day, they're going to get picked up by that current, and they're going to fly a little bit further than maybe they would if when they're just flapping their wings. And they fly for a while during the day. So this is your next question here. So how many hours do you think the monarch flies during its migration season? Go ahead and pop your answers in the questions there. How many hours do they fly per day? Ooh, some great answers there. Okay, a couple more coming in. So they fly 3 to 4 hours per day, and this entire journey takes them about 2 months to go from the northern part all the way down to Mexico. And people always ask me, well, how high do they fly? So they've been shown to fly at 800 to 1,200 feet, with the record being 11,000 feet. And they've also been seen from airplanes. So this is absolutely amazing to me when you think about this tiny little butterfly, and it can fly that high and still somehow make it all the way down to Mexico. So I'm going to tie in citizen science here for a second, because a lot of what we know about monarchs is because of volunteers and because of public observations. So one simple thing that you can do is offer food sources by planting those native species that benefit monarchs and their other pollinators. And each plant that you plant actually does make a difference. So if you can see this large, bold red line here, that's basically the route of I-35. And there's been the Iowa DOT, along with other state DOTs and conservation groups and just private landowners, that have focused a lot on planting different plants that are beneficial to the monarch butterfly. So where the dashed line is where there's a high monarch production. So you can see Iowa falls in that, along with Minnesota. And then as you go down, go all the way down to Mexico, that's that kind of I-35 route. And if you're interested in learning more about some citizen science that you can do that relate to monarchs, we are going to have Nathan Brockman with Ryman Gardens is going to be presenting a webinar on August 7th. So you can learn more about pollinators, citizen science, and the importance of those natives. And that will be listed on our treesforever.org website, so you can find out more information about that event. So this might seem surprising, but not all monarchs migrate. Not every monarch goes to Mexico. It's the 4th generation, or the great-great-grandchildren that are born in the north, that go to Mexico. So here in Iowa, some of those monarchs will breed at the beginning of August. And that, if you assume that that is the 4th generation from the north, their offspring is the 5th generation, and those are the ones that are going to travel all the way down to Mexico. So right now, we're starting to see monarchs that are coming back up from Texas, returning from that southern area. And if you go outside and look on the milkweeds, you might be finding eggs. And you might also be finding those first and second instars of caterpillars. And then in the fall season, which begins late August to mid-September here in the Midwest, is the time for when they're going to start traveling back down to Mexico and when we typically tag those monarchs. So if you want to know more about tagging and why we tag, you can join us on September 6th at Big Hollow Recreation Area, which is located in Des Moines County. So we're going to partner up with the Conservation Board, and we're going to teach you how to tag monarchs and why we're tagging them. This event is part of the Stewards of the Beautiful Land Field Days. So where did I go and when did I go? So I stayed in a small town of Macheros, which their population is about 400. According to the locals, they will tell you a little bit less than that. And it's approximately 2.5 hours from Mexico City to the Sierra Pelon B&B, which is where I stayed, located in that town of Macheros. So I traveled in March of 2020 and in March of 2024. So I have great plans to go back in the off season just to do some hiking and horseback riding. And my goal is now to go visit the monarchs in each month over the next few years. Also, some people stay in Zitácuaro, which is also 2.5 miles from Mexico City. And then if you want to travel from there to Macheros to go to the Sierra Pelon Sanctuary, that's about 15 to 20 minutes. So the monarch season in Mexico is November 20th to March 15th. So that's kind of when they arrive to when they leave. But January and February is the prime time to visit, or when most people visit. This is where you're going to see large amounts of clusters of these butterflies, and they're going to be just hanging out in the trees there. You're going to experience something different any date that you go, or any day that you go in Mexico, because with weather changes and just temperature changes, you're going to experience something different each time. So just a heads up for you out there, if you get car sick, please keep in mind this is a rough car ride from Mexico City to the mountainous area. It's also very windy hills, and there's also that factor of the elevation change there. So if I had to say, out of the sanctuaries that I visited, if you can only go to one location, I would go to Sierra Pelon. This is the least touristy. There are no shops. There's no restrooms. It is a 2-minute walk or less from the B&B. Their guides speak English. They're locals to Macheros, and they have been watching these butterflies for their entire life, and they truly care about the forest and the monarchs, and they have become part of their culture. And the second one I would say would be Sierra Chinqua, which is 2 hours from Sierra Pelon. This sanctuary has restrooms, shops, places to eat. You'll typically, at any sanctuary you go to, you will ride the horses up the mountain, and then you'll hike your way down. Third one is El Rosario, and this is probably the most touristy one that I visited. Just a lot more shops, and once you get up to the top, kind of, so to speak, where the butterflies are, you'll walk back down, and then they have a lot of stairs that take you back down to the parking lot area there. So this map does a great job of showing us where the traditional monarch butterflies are overwintering. So there are about 12 sites or sanctuaries, and at least 70% of these monarchs are typically found concentrated in only 3 sites there. So these 3 sites where they're typically found are in the region of central Mexico, and it's in the states of Michoacan and Mexico. And these areas are like 5-star hotels for these monarchs. So this is a great graph of showing our overwintering sites each year. So this year, the monarch numbers were really low. So they occupied about 0.9 hectares, and each hectare, just to put it into perspective for you, is about 2.5 acres. And so each year you'll see that they kind of vary on how much space that they take up, but it's estimated between 20 to 30 million monarchs per hectare. And the presence of these butterflies is typically in the Oyamel Pine Forests. And this population this last season was 59.3% less than the previous year. And it's 1.3 less than the 2.21 acres in the 2022-2023 overwintering season. So this is huge for monarch populations. It's the first time since 2013 and 2014 that their overwintering season has been less than 1 hectare for them. So in order to maintain the population numbers, scientists say about 6 hectares and about 14.8 acres. So people are like, okay, why this decrease in monarchs? Well, there's lots of reasons why there's a decrease. So there's climatic changes in Canada and the US. We're seeing higher temperatures. We're seeing droughts. There's a reduced amount of milkweed for them to feed on. We also are seeing land use changes in the US, and the widespread use of herbicides has contributed to the loss of milkweed and other nectar plants that the adults need to feed on. So if you take a look like towards the southern part here, and you find that area where there's sort of where it's black in color, these are the areas where they typically go from October to late March. And so if you are going to these areas and you are a monarch butterfly, this is absolutely the best travel spot in the world. So they are going to roost in the Oyamel fir, pine, and cedar forests. And so these trees are at about 2,400 to 3,600 meters high. So that's roughly 1.5 to 2 miles above sea level. The forested mountainsides there provide the ideal microclimate for butterflies. The temperatures are going to range from 0 to 15 degrees Celsius and 32 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So if the temperature is lower than that, the monarchs are forced to use their fat reserves that they had built up before migrating. And the humidity in the Oyamel forest also assures that the monarchs won't dry out, which allows them to conserve their energy over the winter. So just to take a look here, these are the Oyamel firs. To me, they look a lot like the firs that we see here in Iowa. So the typically sort of flat needles. These are very straight when they grow, and they are super tall when you're up there hiking through them. And then the monarchs also like to roost in smooth bark Mexican pine, or it's also called Mexican cedar or the cypress trees. So you can just see here on the left is the pine trees. I think they look a lot like our white pine trees here in Iowa with the softer needles, except for these needles are extremely long. And then on the right side there, you're going to see those berries from our cedar trees. So what did I see when I hiked up the mountain? Well, I saw lots of clustering of butterflies. So in this picture, you can see from the top of that tree all the way down, that's all monarch butterflies. And then kind of towards the back of the photo there, you can see what looks like something hanging from the trees. Those are also clusters of monarchs. So they estimate around 15,000 monarchs on a single branch. So my question for you is, how much do you think a monarch butterfly weighs? And maybe give it to me in grams here, because that was my conversion there. Love to see those comments coming in, how much they think that monarch weighs. This is always a fun fact with kids because they're estimating like pounds and pounds, but it is much less than that. So each monarch weighs less than a gram, and that's equivalent to about 1 small paperclip. And so this is what clustering looks like up close. So you'll see it's just butterfly after butterfly. You're seeing very little of the branches and very little of those needles from the trees there. And it makes sense for these monarch butterflies to cluster together like this. Monarchs, like other insects, are cold-blooded, so they are warmer when they're stuck together. And if you are in the forest and you have the chance to see one of these large clusters just fly up all at once, they call this an explosion or a kaleidoscope of butterflies. And I watched this a few times, and it's absolutely amazing because when you're standing there in the forest and it's super quiet, when they explode like that, you just hear all the flapping of all the wings from the butterflies. It's pretty impressive. You will also see butterflies that are basking in the sun. So the photo on the right here, they're just hanging out on the trees. They'll flap their wings a few times and just rest there. And they're basically just sitting there waiting for that sun to warm up their body temperature. They will also do something that's called shivering, which is a way for them to warm up their muscles. And basically they will move their wings so fast that it actually warms up their bodies. So in order for a monarch to be able to fly, it has to be 55 degrees, at least 50 on a sunny day, and then 60 on a cloudy day. And they can't crawl if it's not 41 degrees Fahrenheit. So in the photo on the left, this is Joel. He's the owner of Sierra Palone B&B. He's also a guide. He's a local, so he's lived there most of his life. And you can see there's monarchs there on the ground. He's picked one of those monarchs up, and what he's doing is he's going to cup his hands, and then he'll gently blow air into his hands that will help warm the butterfly. And then seconds after this photo happened, that butterfly just flew off. So it was warm enough. So I'm going to show you a video here so you can kind of see what that shivering looks like. And I just want you to sort of listen as this video plays.